Baba Yaga does not need to be found. The hut finds you, and if you come to her with demands, she will devour you. But if you come with nothing but your fear and your truth, she will hand you the fire that burns your enemies to ash. The question is not whether she is a monster. The question is what you are when you stand before her now. Let that thought settle. Let your shoulders fall, just slightly, away from your ears. Let the breath move softly, as if you were already in the quiet of the deep forest. There is nowhere else you need to be if it feels right. Let your eyes close now, or leave them open. Either way, the story is already here, waiting in the dark between the trees. Picture, if you like, a path of packed earth, winding away from the last plowed field. The birches grow taller. The air cools. Ahead, something creaks. The slow, heavy sound of a house turning on its legs. This story holds everything the old grandmothers knew about fear and courage. It has been told before by firelight in rooms much quieter than this one. It is still true. And if you find yourself returning to this place for more quiet stories, you might choose to leave a small mark, the way a traveler carves a sign on a tree, but only if you wish. So let the path carry you back before the hero, back before the fire, back to when the forest was still older than the gods, and a girl stood at its edge, holding nothing but a doll. Chapter 1. Edge of the Known World. The story does not begin in the forest. It begins in a village small enough that every family knew the sound of every other family's axe. The izba stood low and dark, their thatched roofs heavy with moss, their single rooms lit by the petch stove's orange mouth. At night, the only light for miles was the glow behind oiled-skinned windows. Beyond the last plowed field, the trees waited in perfect, black silence. In one of those izbas, a woman lay dying, and her daughter knelt beside the wooden sleeping platform, holding a hand that was already cooling. The girl's name was Vasilisa, and she was young enough to still believe that love could hold a person in the world. Her mother's eyes moved to her face with an effort that took everything she had left. The mother drew a small cloth doll from beneath her pillow and pressed it into Vasilisa's hands. It was nothing much to look at, stitched from scraps of old linen, with 2 dark threads for eyes and a scrap of red cloth tied over its head like a kerchief. But the mother's voice, when she spoke, was steadier than it had been in days. "Keep this with you always. Tell no one." She told Vasilisa that the doll would help her, that all she needed to do was feed it a few crumbs and a drop of water and whisper what troubled her heart, and the doll would answer. Then the mother's grip loosened. The petch fire crackled once, as if the room itself understood what had just passed. Vasilisa was alone with a rag doll, and a silence so complete it felt like the floor had fallen away. In the months that followed, Vasilisa learned what grief tasted like. It was not only the absence of her mother, but the arrival of something else, her father's new wife, a widow who came with her own 2 daughters and settled into the izba as if she had always owned it. The stepmother had narrow eyes that never seemed to blink at the same time, and a voice that could make even kindness sound like a threat. The stepsisters were no better. They dressed in Vasilisa's mother's embroidered blouses and slept in the warmest corner of the stove platform, while Vasilisa was given a thin blanket and a space near the door where the winter drafts found every gap in the timber. The doll whispered comfort in the dark, its voice so small it might have been her own thought. "Feed me," it seemed to say, "and you will not be alone." She fed it crumbs from her portion of bread, always the smallest portion, and drops of water from the wooden bucket by the door. And the doll listened. It did not speak in words so much as in feelings, a warmth spreading through her chest, a sudden clarity about which task to do next, a quiet certainty that she was not as invisible as the stepmother wanted her to be. She grew thin, but she did not grow weak. The stepmother noticed. It troubled her that the girl did not break, did not become ugly with resentment, did not make mistakes that could be punished openly. And so she began to watch Vasilisa more closely, searching for the source of that quiet resilience, that maddening steadiness. She never found the doll, which Vasilisa kept tucked inside her dress against her skin, where no one thought to look. By the time Vasilisa was old enough to be called beautiful, the stepmother's patience had worn as thin as the girl's winter blanket. Beauty in a stepdaughter was not an asset, it was a problem. A mirror that reflected everything the stepmother was not. The sisters, too, felt it, the way their own faces seemed to curdle in the village boy's eyes whenever Vasilisa passed. Something had to be done. The plan was simple and cruel, the way such plans always are. One evening, while Vasilisa was walking back from the well, the stepmother sent the stepsisters through the izba with a wet rag, smothering every last ember in the petch, every candle, every oil lamp, until the house was as dark as the inside of a closed fist. When Vasilisa returned, the stepmother's voice came out of the blackness, smooth as river stone. "Go to Baba Yaga's hut. Bring us fire." The village was already behind her. Not as a memory, but as a dwindling glow, the last izba's oil lamp swallowed by distance, in the black wall of pines. Vasilisa walked with the doll against her heart. Her feet knew the path only as far as the fields. Beyond that, the trees decided. The forest did not welcome her. It simply opened, the way a door opens for someone it has been expecting. The birches gave way to older things, oaks thick as church pillars, pines that had never felt an axe. The moss underfoot swallowed her footsteps, so that she seemed to move through the dark without making a sound. She walked for what felt like hours, though time in that place was a slippery thing. The doll stayed silent, but its presence was steady, a small ember of warmth against her ribs. She had brought no food for it. A child trusts a gift from the dying in a way no adult can. At a certain point, the path stopped being a path. It became a suggestion, a faint indentation in the leaf litter that might have been made by deer or by something that walked on two legs. Vasilisa paused. In the village, silence meant safety. Here, silence was a held breath, and she was inside its lungs. Then she saw the first bone. It stood upright in the earth, a human femur driven into the soil like a fence post. Beyond it, another, and another. They marched in a ragged circle, arm bones woven between them. And atop each post, a human skull sat facing outward, its jaw missing, its eye sockets dark. One of the skulls flickered. A small orange tongue of flame appeared in its left socket, then its right, as if someone had lit a lamp inside an empty room. Then the next skull ignited, and the next, until the whole fence burned with a steady, silent fire that gave off no heat but illuminated the clearing with the color of molten amber. There is no need to picture the fence too clearly. It is enough to know it was there, and that it had been waiting for her. Vasilisa did not run. She looked at the skulls, and the skulls looked back at her, with the patience of things that have already been dead for a long time and are in no hurry to be joined. Beyond the fence, the hut stood on its massive chicken legs, folded beneath it like a roosting bird. Its timbers were dark with age, its thatched roof sagging under centuries of moss. The single window was shuttered. The heavy oak door faced away from her. Its latch was a row of interlocking human teeth. She had heard the words once, from an old woman in the village who told tales by the stove. Little hut, turn your back to the forest, and your front to me. She whispered them now, and the sound of her own voice in that place was the bravest thing she had ever done. The hut heard her. The legs shifted. The timbers groaned. Slowly, with the grinding patience of something that has stood since before the first village was built, the hut began to turn. The chicken legs stomped once, twice, sinking their talons into the moss. The skulls blazed brighter, and Vasilisa, holding her doll against her hammering heart, watched the tooth-latched door swing into view. Whatever waited inside, she had already crossed the boundary. There was no path back, and the darkness that waited there was far older than the girl who now stood before it. Chapter 2. What the Forest Remembered. Before the first village was staked into the black soil, before the first iron axe bit into a birch trunk, the forest was already old. It covered the land in a single, unbroken breath of pine and oak and shadow, stretching from the northern seas to the steppe grasslands, and in its deepest places, the sunlight never reached the ground. What moved there had no name, and needed none. The people who would one day arrive brought their own gods with them, but they also found gods already waiting. The oldest of these was a woman made of winter. They called her Morena in some valleys. Marzana in others, a goddess of the last frost, the black field, the breath that stops. She was not worshipped so much as survived. She was the cold hand that closed the eyes of the dead, the silence after the final exhale. When the year turned toward darkness, the people carried her effigy to the river and drowned it, or burned it on a pyre of pine branches, sending her back into the frozen earth so that spring could return. But she never stayed gone. She only retreated deeper into the trees, where the snow never fully melted. In those same centuries, when an elder died or a child was taken by fever, the people built small houses for the dead at the forest's edge. Not graves dug into the soil, but wooden structures raised on carved posts. Huts that kept the body above the frozen ground where the wolves could not reach. They placed food inside, and tools, and sometimes a small clay lamp with the last of the household fire. The posts beneath those funerary huts were often wrapped with the bones of sacrificed animals, chickens mostly, whose spirits were meant to carry the dead into the next world. Over generations, as the old language faded and the rituals were forgotten, the memory of those structures remained only as an image half understood. A house that stood on bird-like legs, a hut that walked between the living and the dead. And the keeper of that gate, who else could she be but the crone who had always been there? The death goddess who had been driven from the villages but never truly banished. She settled into the forgotten funerary huts, the way a bird settles into a nest that has waited too long for its occupant. And the forest accepted her return without surprise. The trees had never stopped believing in her. There is no need to imagine her birth. She was never born. She was simply what the old goddess became when the new faith arrived with its bright icons and its single god, a religion of light that pushed everything dark into the woods. The idols were toppled, the sacred groves were felled, but the fear and reverence that had fed Morena for centuries could not be destroyed, only displaced. The old woman who emerged from that displacement was not the goddess she had been. She was smaller, stranger, more specific. One of her legs had turned to bare bone, kostyanaya noga, as if half of her had already crossed into the realm of the dead and decided to stay there. She wore the red kerchief of a grandmother, but her hands were long and knobbed, her fingernails curling like horn, her eyes amber and still. She found her tools waiting for her, or perhaps they found her. An iron mortar large enough to sit in, a heavy pestle that could crush more than grain, a broom of birch twigs that swept away every trace of her passage. She did not invent flight. She remembered it, from the time when gods moved freely between worlds, and the mortar rose beneath her weight as if it had been waiting centuries to be lifted. By the time the first storyteller spoke her name aloud, she was already complete. Baba Yaga, the grandmother of terror, the bony-legged one who rides the wind in a grinding bowl, and lives in a house that turns to face the visitor on its own. The name spread from village to village like a fire warning, and in every telling, one detail remained fixed. She was old when the world was young, and she will be old when the last fire goes out. The hut was not merely her home. It was her skin, her sentinel, her collaborator. The great scaled legs that lifted it from the earth moved with an intelligence older than instinct. It turned without being told, walked without being guided, and settled into the moss with the patient weight of a roosting beast. The tooth-latch door opened only for those who knew the words, and the petch oven inside glowed with a hunger that was not for bread. There were stories that she was not one, but three sisters, all named Baba Yaga, each dwelling in her own hut in her own part of the endless forest. Some tales said they shared a single eye among them, passing it back and forth like a polished river stone. Others claimed they were simply aspects of the same ancient woman, split across the landscape so that no traveler ever truly escaped her reach. Her body was a map of contradictions. The red kerchief, bright as fresh blood, pooled tight over matted gray hair that had not felt a comb in centuries. Her spine curved forward like a question mark, and her breasts hung low to her waist, heavy and bare beneath her shawl. One leg was the bone white of winter branches, skeletal and bare. The other, flesh and sinew, ending in a gnarled foot with toenails thick as horn. To look at her was to see life and death sharing a single form. She rode the sky in a grinding bowl. The iron mortar was not a chariot. It was a tool of transformation, the same vessel that crushed grain into flour and bones into dust. With the heavy pestle she steered, nudging the clouds aside, and behind her, the birch brooms swept the sky clean of every trace, so that no one could follow her path or guess where she had landed. She moved like weather, sudden, silent, and absolute. She was never simply evil. That was the misunderstanding of later ages, the flattening of a complex and ancient law into the simple shape of a villain. Baba Yaga devoured those who came to her with arrogance and demands, but the girl who arrived with nothing but humility and a willingness to work, that girl might leave with fire in her hands. She was the forest's immune system, and the forest does not hate what it kills. Her laughter was the sound of dry branches breaking under snow. When she laughed, which was rarely, the skulls on the fence flickered brighter, as if sharing a joke that only the dead could understand. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was low and rough, the voice of stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. There was no cruelty in it, only the ancient, settled certainty of a creature who had outlived every argument. The words that commanded the hut were older than any language spoken in the villages. Izbushka, Izbushka, turn your back to the forest, your front to me. They were not a spell so much as a password, a key carved from syllables that had been old when the first storyteller shaped them. The hut obeyed because it had been waiting for someone to speak those words, and it had been waiting a very long time. The first traveler to find her clearing had no stories to guide him, only hunger and a lost path. He saw the skull fence and mistook it for a warning. He saw the hut and mistook it for a trap. He did not knock. He pushed, and the tooth-latched door opened its mouth and swallowed him before he could scream. The lesson was written into the wood itself. Respect the threshold, or become part of it. Word of her spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped into dark water. Travelers began to leave offerings at the forest's edge, a loaf of rye bread, a handful of salt, a small carved bird. Sometimes the offerings vanished. Sometimes they were left untouched, as if she had no use for what was given without heart. The villagers learned to speak her name in whispers, not because she would come for them, but because naming her too loudly felt like inviting winter into the house. She was not a curse that could be lifted, nor a monster that could be slain. She was a boundary, the living, breathing edge between the village and the wild, between the known world and the dark where all knowing ended. And she was patient. The centuries passed like hours. Empires rose and fell beyond her forest, and she remained, turning slowly in her hut, waiting. What waited with her was a reign of fear that stretched as wide as the trees themselves, and it had only just begun to be understood. Chapter 3. The Law of the Clearing. The clearing was a world unto itself, a pocket of perpetual twilight carved into the deepest part of the forest. Sunlight never reached the mossy ground. The only illumination came from the skulls, dozens of them, mounted on a palisade of human femurs and woven arm bones, their eye sockets burning with a steady, silent orange fire. It cast long, unmoving shadows and painted the hut in hues of amber and charcoal. The fence was not a warning. A warning can be ignored. This was a boundary, absolute and ancient, and the skulls that crowned it did not threaten or leer. They simply watched with the patient, unblinking attention of things that had already seen everything there was to see. There is no need to count them. It is enough to know they were there, and that their light never wavered, not even in the heaviest rain. The hut itself was a compact izba of rough-hewn timbers, blackened by centuries of smoke and weather. Its thatched roof sagged under a thick coat of moss, and a chimney of woven twigs and small animal bones released a thin, constant curl of pale smoke. The single small window was always shuttered. The heavy oak door faced whatever direction the hut chose, and its latch was made of interlocking human teeth. Beneath the hut, the massive chicken legs folded and unfolded with the slow, grinding sound of trees bending in a storm. Their scaled skin was the color of old iron, and each talon was longer than a man's forearm. When the hut turned, the legs stomped in a deliberate rhythm, sinking deep into the moss. When it was still, they tucked beneath the izba like a roosting bird, patient and waiting. Inside, the great brick petch stove dominated the single room. Its iron door glowed with a heat that never died, and its flat top was wide enough for a person to sleep on, or for something else entirely. The stove was the hut's heart, and its hunger was legendary. It baked bread for the worthy and consumed the unworthy with equal indifference, the way a fire consumes whatever is placed inside it. She was not alone in her domain. 3 horsemen served her, or perhaps they simply existed alongside her 3 figures, who rode in silence around the clearing, their paths never crossing. The first rode a white horse, and wore white, and his passing brought the dawn. The second rode a red horse and wore red, and the sun rode with him. The third rode a black horse and wore black, and behind him the sky filled with stars. They never spoke, and she never thanked them. It was not that kind of relationship. When she wished to leave, she climbed into the iron mortar, a vessel large enough to hold her hunched frame, and rose into the air without effort. The heavy wooden pestle served as her tiller, nudging the clouds aside. Behind her, the birch broom swept the sky clean, erasing every trace of her passage so that no one could follow her home. She moved like weather, sudden and silent, and the villages below never knew she had passed until the wind changed. Her powers were not the kind that could be listed or catalogued. She knew the names of things that had been dead for centuries. She could grant the water of life and the water of death, though she rarely did either without a reason that made sense only to her. She could crush bone to meal in her mortar and bake it into bread. What she did was not magic in the way the villagers understood it. It was simply what she was. The people who lived in the shadow of the forest knew her habits and adapted. They left offerings at the tree line, dark bread, salt, a carved wooden bird, not as bribes, but as acknowledgments, the way one leaves a portion of the harvest for the spirits of the field. They taught their children never to stray from the path, never to speak her name after dark, and never, under any circumstance, to enter the deep forest with a demand in their heart. This was the ecology of fear she had cultivated over centuries, and it was not malevolence. The wolf does not hate the deer. The winter does not despise the leaf. Baba Yaga was the forest's immune system, a force that devoured what was too arrogant to survive and tested what was humble enough to be worthy. Her reign was not a reign of terror in the way humans understood the word. It was a reign of balance, and the forest had never known another. Those who came to her clearing fell into 2 categories: and there was almost no third. The first arrived with swords and demands, with arrogance thick as winter wool, and they never left. The fens grew by a femur, a tibia, a freshly mounted skull whose eye sockets soon flickered to life. The second arrived with nothing but need and a willingness to work. They left changed lighter, perhaps, or heavier, with the knowledge they had not asked for. Neither outcome was personal. It was simply the law of the clearing. She assigned tasks the way a potter tests clay, not to break it, but to see what it could hold. Sorting a mountain of poppy seeds from a pile of ash before dawn. Separating millet from dirt with only a candle for light. Cleaning a yard littered with bones and refusing to ask whose they were. The work was impossible, and that was the point. What the visitor brought to the work, patience, humility, the ability to accept help from a grateful mouse or a whispered doll, was what she was actually measuring. She knew things, not the way a scholar knows, through study and parchment, but the way the earth knows what lies buried in it. She knew the location of the water of life and the water of death, twin springs that bubbled up in a part of the forest no living person had ever found without her guidance. She knew the true names of the winds. She knew what a man was thinking before he had finished thinking it. This knowledge had no source. It had always been there, and so had she. The three riders continued their eternal circuit. White, red, black. Dawn, noon, night. They were not her servants in any meaningful sense. They predated her, perhaps, or they were fragments of the same ancient collapse that had turned a death goddess into a grandmother of the forest. They passed her window in silence, and she did not look up from her mortar. The rhythm they kept was older than timekeeping, and it asked nothing of her but acknowledgement. There were seasons when the forest was quiet, even by her standards. The snow fell for weeks, burying the bone fence to the eye sockets, and the skull fires burned low and blue beneath their white caps. In those months, the hut rarely moved. Baba Yaga sat by the petch stove, her bony leg propped on a stool, grinding nothing in particular in her mortar roots, old bones, dried mushrooms, while the pestle turned in slow circles. The silence was absolute, and she preferred it that way. Then spring would come, and with it, the travelers. Lost hunters stumbled into the clearing, their faces white with cold and recognition. Desperate mothers arrived carrying sick children, having walked for days on rumors alone. Young men seeking glory came with iron knives and loud voices, and the tooth-latched door opened for them with a hunger it rarely showed. The skulls flared brighter. The petch oven crackled. The cycle began again. Her relationship with the villagers was not worship, but negotiation, and it had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. A good harvest might require a basket of rye left at the boundary stone. A safe childbirth might cost a red ribbon tied to a birch at the forest's edge. No one spoke these terms aloud. They were passed down in gestures, in the way a grandmother touched the bread before placing it in the oven, in the way a father did not look back when he left the offering. Belief without doctrine. Practice without priest. She had favorites, though she would never have used that word. The mice who lived in the walls of her hut, who helped the clever girls sort grain from ash. The small birds who nested in the thatch, whose ancestors had carried messages for her in a time before writing. The spiders who spun their webs across the tooth-latched door, catching the morning mists like tiny nets. She fed them crumbs from her own portion, and in return, they told her what moved in the forest beyond her sight. To stand in her clearing was to stand outside time. The seasons passed, the green hush of summer, the gold crackle of autumn, the white weight of winter, but the hut never aged. The skulls never dimmed. The old woman in the red kerchief never grew older or younger. She had settled into her reign the way a stone settles into a riverbed, and the current of centuries flowed around her without moving her an inch. She was not waiting for anything. She was simply there, complete and eternal, a fact of the forest that no axe could fell and no prayer could soften. And yet, For all her permanence, she was not the end of the story. The forest held her, but the villages held something else, a thread of hope, a whispered name, a girl with a doll. Heroes had tried to reach her clearing before, and their bones lined the fence. But no hero had ever arrived with nothing but a blessing and a question. That would change. The hut turned slowly on its legs, and the skulls burned on. And somewhere in the village, a stepmother was already scheming. The forest was waiting. It had always been waiting, and the girl was already on her way. Chapter 4. The Hand That Did Not Knock. The hut had stopped turning. The great chicken legs settled into the moss with a final, grinding creak, and the tooth-latched door faced her squarely, no more than 20 paces away. The skulls on the fence burned steadily, their amber light falling across Vasilisa's face and the pale birch trunks behind her. She did not move. The forest held its breath, and so did she. She had been walking for hours, or perhaps for days. Time in that place was a thing that slipped away from you, like water through fingers. But now, standing in the stillness of the clearing, she felt the weight of every step she had taken to get here. The cold hearth, the stepmother's voice in the dark, the path that stopped being a path, the first bone in the earth. The doll was warm against her heart. It had been warm since the moment she crossed the tree line, as if the forest itself had woken something inside the stitched linen, something that had been sleeping through all the years of kitchen drudgery and stepsister taunts. Now it pulsed with a steady, gentle heat, the rhythm of a heartbeat that was not her own. She remembered the night her mother had given it to her, the low flame of the oil lamp, the pale hand pressing the doll into her palms, the voice, barely a whisper, telling her to keep it always, to feed it, to tell no one. At the time, she had been too young to understand that her mother was giving her the only protection that could survive the stepmother's house, something invisible, patient, and impossible to confiscate. That protection had fed on crumbs and droplets of water, on whispered fears in the dark corner by the drafty door. It had never asked for more than she could give, and in return, it had given her steadiness, the quiet certainty that she was not alone, even when the stepmother's eyes followed her like a winter wind. The doll had been preparing her for this clearing long before she knew the clearing existed. The stepmother's face rose in her mind, unbidden. The narrow eyes, the smooth voice that could turn a command into a curse. "Go to Baba Yaga! Bring us fire!" It had not been a request. It had been a death sentence, wrapped in the language of a domestic errand, delivered with the confidence of a woman who had already divided Vasilisa's few possessions among her own daughters. But the stepmother had made a mistake. She had assumed the forest would do her work for her. Vasilisa looked down at the doll, pulling it gently from her dress and cradling it in her cupped palms. The tiny embroidered eyes caught the skull light, two black threads that seemed, in this moment, to hold more wisdom than any living gaze. She did not speak to it aloud. She did not need to. The warmth spread through her hands and up her arms, and with it came a thought that felt like a voice. You have already done the hardest part. You came. There is a kind of courage that does not roar. It does not draw swords or shout challenges at the darkness. It simply takes one more step when every instinct screams to turn back, and then another, until the body has carried the heart where the heart was too frightened to go. Vasilisa had been taking those steps since she left the village, and she did not stop now. She passed through the gap in the bone fence, not a gate, but a space where two femurs leaned away from each other, as if the fence itself had anticipated her arrival. The skulls on either side flared slightly brighter as she passed, then dimmed again to their steady watchfire glow. They did not threaten. They simply noted her passing, the way a doorkeeper notes the name of a guest. The tooth-latch door was close now. She could see the individual teeth set into the dark oak molars and incisors, yellowed with age but still sharp, interlocking in a grin that was not quite a grin. Above the door, something was carved into the lintel, a symbol she did not recognize, older than any alphabet, worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind. She stopped an arm's length away and lifted her hand. She did not knock. The door knew she was there. The teeth set into the dark oak seemed to relax, the interlocking grin softening, and with a sound like old bones shifting in a grave, the door swung inward. Warm air rushed out, carrying the scent of wood smoke and rye, and something sharper beneath the dry, mineral smell of ancient feathers. The hut had accepted her. There was no turning back now. The interior was larger than it should have been. The great pitch stove dominated the room, its iron mouth glowing orange, its flat top piled with dark furs. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and on every surface, the table, the shelves, the windowsill, small objects were arranged: clay bowls, polished bones, a single black feather, a coil of red thread. Nothing was decorative. Everything had a use she could not guess. And there, in the deepest corner where the firelight barely reached, something moved. A long, gnarled hand emerged first, knobbed fingers curling around the arm of a chair hewn from a single blackened log. Then the red kerchief. Then the amber eyes, catching the firelight like twin coals. Baba Yaga leaned forward into the light, her hunched body casting a shadow that swallowed half the room. Her voice, when it came, was low and rough, the sound of stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "I know why you are here," she said, though Vasilisa had not spoken. "Your stepmother sent you for fire. She thinks I will eat you. She is not entirely wrong about what I do to girls who come uninvited." The crone's thin lips curled, not quite a smile. "But you did not come uninvited. You came because you were told to, and you obeyed. That is something. Not much, but something." She rose from the chair, and Vasilisa saw her fully, the bony leg, bare and yellowed, clicking against the wooden floor, the long breasts swaying beneath her shawl, the horn-like nails catching the light. She was terrifying in the way a cliff face is terrifying. Not because it means you harm, but because it does not care whether you fall. "You will work for your fire," Baba Yaga said. "And if you cannot do the work, you will feed the fence. That is the law." There is no need to picture the tasks too clearly. It is enough to know that they were impossible. A mountain of poppy seeds mixed with ash, to be separated before dawn. A yard full of bones, to be cleaned and sorted. A river of water to be carried in a sieve. Vasilisa listened to each demand in silence, and with each word, the doll pressed warmer against her heart. "Feed me," it seemed to whisper, "and begin." She worked through the night while the crone watched from her chair. Her fingers bled, her back ached, and whenever her strength faltered, she slipped a crumb of bread to the doll beneath her dress, and a warmth spread through her. Not strength exactly, but something quieter, something that felt like her mother's hand on her brow. The mouse came to help with the seeds. The bird came to help with the bones. The sieve held water when she sang to it, though she did not know where the song came from. The three riders passed the window white, then red, then black, and Vasilisa asked no questions. That was the final test, and she did not know she was being tested until it was already over. When dawn broke white and cold, Baba Yaga stood over the finished tasks and said nothing for a long time. Then she reached into the petch oven and withdrew a human skull, its eye sockets blazing with fire that did not consume it. "Take it," the crone said. "You came for fire. Now you have fire. Go home, child, and let it light your way." Vasilisa took the skull in her trembling hands. It was warm, not hot, and it pulsed with the same steady rhythm as the doll against her heart. She did not thank Baba Yaga. Some gifts are too heavy for thanks. She simply turned and walked out through the tooth-latched door into the gray morning, the skull's fire casting long shadows behind her. The bone fence parted for her as it had before, and the skulls atop it watched her go with their eternal, unblinking patience. The path through the forest seemed shorter now, as if the trees had drawn back their roots to speed her passage. Behind her, the hut creaked once and began to turn away, its door swinging back toward the dark. Baba Yaga did not watch her leave. She had already returned to her mortar, grinding something ancient, indifferent to the girl who now carried a piece of her fire back into the world. And what that fire would do, once it reached the village, was already written in the bones. Chapter 5. The Fire That Knew Its Way. The forest that had swallowed her on the way in now seemed to part before her. The birches drew back their pale trunks. The pines lifted their lowest branches. The path that had vanished beneath her feet now reappeared, a ribbon of packed earth that seemed to glow faintly in the skull's amber light. Vasilisa walked without stopping. She did not look back at the clearing. She did not need to. The skull in her hands was warm, but not hot, its fire steady and silent. It cast no smoke, asked for no fuel, and made no sound except a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration she felt in her palms more than she heard. The doll against her heart pulsed in the same rhythm, as if the two fires recognized each other, as if they had always been part of the same flame. She passed the landmark she had barely registered on her journey in, the lightning-struck oak with its hollow core, the small stream where she had knelt to drink, the clearing where the mist had curled around her ankles like a living thing. Each looked smaller now, less menacing, as if the forest had been testing her and had now withdrawn its fangs. She was no longer prey. She carried the predator's fire. The boundary stone came into view through the thinning trees, the moss-covered boulder where generations of villagers had left their offerings of bread and salt and carved wooden birds. There was a fresh loaf resting there now, still steaming in the cold dawn air, left by some desperate soul while she was inside the hut. The skull's fire reflected in the dark crust. She walked past it without stopping. The village emerged from the gray morning like a memory surfacing from deep water. The familiar izbas, their thatched roofs silvered with frost, their oiled-skin windows still dark. No smoke rose from the chimneys yet. No one was awake to see her emerge from the tree line with a human skull blazing in her hands, her white dress glowing like a ghost's. She crossed the last plowed field, and the soil clung to her bare feet. The stepmother's izba stood at the edge of the village, apart from the others, as if even the neighboring houses had always sensed something cold within its timbers. The door was shut. The window was dark. Vasilisa stopped at the threshold and looked down at the skull. Its fire had not diminished. It burned with the same patient, unblinking intensity as the skulls on the fence, and she understood, suddenly, that it had been waiting for this moment longer than she had been alive. She pushed the door open. The interior was dark, the peck stove cold and gray, exactly as she had left it when she was sent away. The stepmother's voice came out of the shadows immediately, sharp and impatient. "Where have you been? We have been sitting in the dark because of you." But the voice faltered when the skull's light reached the far corner. The narrow eyes widened. The thin lips parted. The skull's fire grew brighter. Not violently, not suddenly. It simply increased, the way the sun increases as it rises. A steady intensification that filled every corner of the izba. The shadows fled. The dust on the floorboards became visible. The spiderwebs in the rafters. The hunger in the stepsisters' faces. The cold calculation in the stepmother's eyes, now melting into something she had never felt before. The stepmother tried to look away. She could not. The stepsisters tried to hide behind the stove. The fire found them. It was not a fire that burned fabric or timber. The linens did not singe. The wooden walls did not char, but it burned something else. something inside them, and they felt it. There was no need to picture what the fire took. It is enough to know that it was just, and that it was final. The skull burned through the night, while Vasilisa sat in the corner where she had once slept, the doll warm against her heart, her eyes closed. She did not watch. She did not need to watch. The fire knew what it was doing, and she had learned in Baba Yaga's hut that some things are not for her to interfere with. The law of the clearing had followed her home, and the law does not require a witness. Morning came slowly, the way it always does after a night that changes everything. Pale gray light slipped through the oiled-skin window and fell across the floorboards, illuminating what the skull's fire had left behind. A fine, dark ash coated the corner where the stepmother had stood. Nothing else. No bones, no cloth, no sign that 3 human bodies had ever occupied the room. Vasilisa opened her eyes. She had not slept, but she had rested in a way she had not rested since her mother died. The doll was still against her heart, its warmth now faint, a gentle ember rather than a blaze. She looked at the ash on the floor and felt nothing. Sharp, no triumph, no horror. Only the quiet recognition that something long owed had finally been settled. She rose and took the birch broom from beside the cold pet stove, the same broom she had used 1,000 times under the stepmother's orders. Now she swept the ash into a small pile, her movements slow and deliberate, a ritual rather than a chore. The skull sat on the table, its fire reduced to a soft amber flicker, and it watched her with the patience of a thing that had done its work. When the floor was clean, she lifted the skull in both hands. The fire in its eye sockets pulsed once, twice, and then went out, leaving only a faint warmth in the bone, the memory of flame. She placed it on the highest shelf, beside her mother's old spindle. It would never burn again, but it would remain a relic of the night the forest's justice visited a village izba and found what it was looking for. There is no need to picture what the fire took. It is enough to know that the room was quiet afterward, and that the silence was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of a fever breaking, of a storm passing, of a door closing that should have closed long ago. Vasilisa stood in the center of the room, and for the first time since her mother's hands had gone still, she was not afraid. She walked outside. The village was waking now, smoke beginning to rise from chimneys, a dog barking somewhere near the well, but no one looked her way. She was still the girl who had been sent into the forest, but she was also something else now, and perhaps the villagers sensed it. She carried a stillness that had not been there before, the stillness of someone who had stood before Baba Yaga and remained. At the edge of the plowed field, she paused and looked back toward the tree line. The forest was a dark wall in the morning mist, revealing nothing, but she knew what lay within it. The hut turning slowly on its chicken legs, the fensive bones, the 3 riders on their eternal circuit, and the old woman in the red kerchief, grinding something ancient in her mortar, indifferent to the girl whose life she had altered forever. The doll pressed against her heart, and a warmth spread through her chest. Not words, not quite, but something like a voice. You carried the fire. You brought it home. You did not look away. It was the closest thing to a blessing she had felt since her mother's hand had released hers, and she accepted it without needing to understand it. The doll had never lied to her. It would not start now. She turned her back on the forest and walked toward the village, toward the empty izba that was now entirely hers, toward a future she could not yet see. The stepmother's schemes had burned away with the stepmother herself. The stepsister's cruelty had turned to ash. What remained was a girl with a doll, a clean floor, and a fire that no one could extinguish. It was more than enough. It was everything. But the hut did not vanish when the skull's fire went out. It turned slowly on its legs, deep in the forest, and waited. What it had set in motion was only beginning to unfold. The crone's justice was never just one death. It was a seed, planted in the soil of the world, and its roots would grow through lives and years in ways no one could predict. The doll knew this. The skull had known it, and the girl who now walked alone through the morning light would one day understand it too. Chapter 6. The Thread That Never Broke. The days that followed were quiet in a way Vasilisa had never known. She rose with the sun, lit the petch stove with her own hands, and ate her bread at a table that no longer belonged to anyone else. The skull sat on the high shelf beside her mother's spindle, dark and still, a relic of a fire that had burned only what needed to burn. She did not speak of it to anyone. There was no one left to tell. The doll remained warm against her heart, though its work had changed. It no longer needed to comfort a frightened girl huddled by a drafty door. Instead, it offered a quieter kind of guidance, the suggestion of a direction, the nudge toward a decision, the steady pulse of a love that had outlasted death and cruelty in the dark of the deep forest. It had become less a protector and more a companion, and she was grateful for both. The village accepted her return without questions, the way villages always accept strange things when they have no framework for understanding them. The stepmother and stepsisters were simply gone, and no one asked where they had gone. The izba was Vasilisa's now, and if the neighbors noticed the dark skull on the high shelf, they did not mention it. Some truths are too heavy for casual conversation, and the people who live at the edge of a dark forest learn early not to pry. She might have stayed there forever, tending the stove and working the fields, growing old in the same house where her mother had died. But the doll had other plans. One evening, as she sat by the fire, it pulsed against her heart with a warmth that felt like urgency, and a thought rose in her mind that was not quite her own. There is more. You are not finished yet. The next morning, she packed her few belongings and walked away from the village without looking back. The city she eventually reached was larger than anything she had ever seen, its wooden walls rising above the river, its market squares loud with merchants and carters and the clatter of hooves on packed earth. She found work as a seamstress in the house of a wealthy merchant woman who noticed the extraordinary delicacy of her stitches. Seams so fine they seemed to disappear into the fabric itself. The woman did not ask where Vasilisa had learned such skill, which was wise of her. It was the linen that changed everything. The merchant woman gave her a commission to weave a bolt of cloth so fine it could pass through a wedding ring. Any other girl would have failed. Vasilisa sat at the loom, the doll warm against her heart, and her fingers moved with a precision that felt borrowed, as if some older, more patient intelligence were guiding her hands. The thread obeyed. The shuttle flew. The linen grew beneath her touch, like something alive. When the bolt was finished, the merchant woman could not believe what she was seeing. The linen was white as winter sunlight, smooth as still water, and so fine that when she folded it, the entire bolt disappeared into the palm of her hand. Word of this miracle reached the Tsar's palace within a week, and soon a messenger arrived at the merchant's door with a single question. Who had woven it, and where could she be found? Vasilisa was brought before the Tsar, a young man with tired eyes who had grown weary of courtiers and flatterers and women who wanted only his crown. He looked at the linen she had woven, then at her hands, then at her face. She did not bow too deeply. She did not speak too quickly. She answered his questions with the same quiet steadiness with which she had answered Baba Yaga, and he recognized something in her, something the forest had taught, something the fire had tested, something the doll had preserved. They were married in the spring, when the birches were budding and the rivers ran clear with snowmelt. Vasilisa wore a dress of the linen she had woven, white and impossibly fine, and the doll was tucked beneath it, against her heart, as it had been on the night she walked into the dark forest, holding nothing but a blessing. The Tsar did not know about the doll. He did not need to know. Some protections are private, and some love is carried too deep to be explained. In the years that followed, Vasilisa became known not as the girl who had been sent to Baba Yaga, but as the Serena who could weave light into cloth, who listened more than she spoke, who never flinched at bad news. The skull sat on a shelf in her private chambers, its eye sockets dark and empty, and occasionally, when the court was asleep and the palace was quiet, she would look at it and remember the clearing, the fence of bones, the old woman's amber eyes catching the firelight. The memory did not frighten her anymore. It had become part of her, woven into the linen of who she was. But the story did not end in the palace, and it never really belonged to Vasilisa alone. The doll had been her mother's gift, and her mother had received something like it from her own mother, who had received it from hers. A thread of protective love passed through generations of women whose names were never written down. The doll was older than the village, older than the forest path, older perhaps than Baba Yaga herself. It was the real bloodline, stitched in linen and red thread. There is no need to trace that lineage too carefully. It is enough to know that the doll continued its quiet work long after Vasilisa's hair had turned gray. It whispered to her daughter, and to her daughter's daughter, and to a girl born in a different village 100 years later, who would one day find herself at the edge of the same dark forest, holding the same tiny figure in her trembling hands. The crone's tests are never taken only once. They repeat, across lives and centuries, whenever a soul stands at the boundary between what is safe and what is necessary. The hut, meanwhile, turned on, deep in the forest, beyond the lightning-struck oak and the small stream and the clearing where the mist curled like a living thing. Baba Yaga sat by her pet stove and ground roots and bones in her iron mortar. The fence of skulls burned steadily through rain and snow and the slow crawl of seasons. The three riders continued their eternal circuit, white, red, black, and the crone did not grow older or younger. She had no need of change. Change was for the living. Travelers still came to her clearing, though perhaps fewer than in the old days. A young hunter, lost and arrogant, whose femur would soon join the fence. A mother with a sick child, desperate enough to offer anything, who left with a small vial of dark water and a warning she did not fully understand. A girl with a doll, sometimes, though not the same girl and not the same doll. The pattern held. The law of the clearing did not bend, because laws that bend eventually break, and Baba Yaga was not in the business of breaking. The villages at the forest's edge continued their quiet negotiations. Offerings appeared at the boundary stone: bread, salt, carved birds, red ribbons tied to birch branches. The old women still touched the bread before placing it in the oven. The young mothers still taught their children never to stray from the path. The practice had no name and no priesthood, but it persisted, because the forest was still dark, and the hut was still there, and some fears are too old to be forgotten, and the stories spread. A tale told by a grandmother in a humble izba, somewhere in the endless Russian winter, reached the ears of a collector who wrote it down in a book that would outlast the grandmother and the izba and the village itself. The collector's name was Afanasyev, and he did not know when he set his pen to paper that he was capturing something that had already survived 1,000 years without being written. The crone did not care about books, but the books cared about her, and so she endured. What Baba Yaga left behind was not a dynasty of bone-legged daughters or a kingdom of the dead. It was a question, asked again and again in every generation that followed. What do you do when you stand at the edge of the dark? Do you draw your sword and demand, or do you kneel and ask? The answer, she had always known, reveals less about the forest than it does about the person standing at its edge. She was a mirror as much as a monster, and mirrors never lie. The skull Vasilisa had carried home sat on its shelf for decades. Then, for centuries, if the stories are to be believed, its eye sockets dark, its bones slowly yellowing with age. It was not an object of worship. It was a reminder of fire, of justice, of the strange mercy of a crone who could have devoured a girl, but chose instead to arm her. When the house finally crumbled and the shelf fell, the skull rolled into the earth and was covered by soil and leaves and the slow accumulation of time. The forest took it back. The forest takes everything back, eventually. This is the nature of Baba Yaga's bloodline. She has no children. She needs none. Every girl who walks into the dark forest holding nothing but a blessing is her descendant. Every woman who survives the impossible task and carries fire back to the village is her heir. The legacy is not in the bone or the blood. It is in the act, the trembling hand raised to the tooth-latched door, the whispered words, the choice to keep walking, when every instinct screams to turn back. That is what she leaves the world, and the world has never stopped needing it. The hut turns on. The skulls burn through the long nights. The crone grinds her roots and bones in her iron mortar, indifferent to the centuries, patient as stone. Somewhere, a girl is standing at the edge of a plowed field, looking into the dark trees, holding a doll made of scraps and red thread. She does not know the story yet. She will. The forest is waiting, and the forest has always been waiting, and the boundary that never closes is about to open once more. Chapter 7. The Boundary That Never Closes. Long after Vasilisa had become a tale told by grandmothers, a different question began to gather in the quieter corners of the world. Not what Baba Yaga did, or whom she devoured, or how a girl escaped her clearing carrying fire, but who she was before the stories. The question was not asked by storytellers. It was asked by scholars, archaeologists, and those who walked the old forest paths with notebooks instead of dolls. The oldest answer wore a name that had nearly been forgotten. Morena, Morzana, the goddess of winter, of the last frost, of the black field that would not yield. The early Slavs did not love her. They survived her. And when the snow began to melt and the first green shoots pushed through the cold soil, they carried her effigy, a crone made of straw and old cloth, to the river and drowned it, or to the pyre and burned it, returning her to the frozen earth so that spring could breathe again. The ritual was loud, with desperate gratitude. Villagers sang and shouted as the straw crone went under the dark water, or blackened in the flames. But in the hush that followed, when the last ember died or the river smoothed itself still, someone always looked back toward the tree line. They knew she was not gone. They had only sent her deeper into the forest, where the snow never fully melted, and the old gods still whispered. The drowning was not a death. It was a boundary drawn, and she had simply stepped across it. In those same centuries, when death visited a household, the living built small houses for the dead at the forest's edge. Not graves sunk into the frozen soil, but wooden chambers raised on carved stilts, their bases wrapped with the bones of sacrificed animals, chickens, most often, whose spirits were meant to carry the departed into the next world. The huts were left to weather in moss and the slow return of the wild. And over generations, their purpose was forgotten, even as their image persisted. The memory of those funerary stilts, warped by time and retelling, became the chicken legs. The death house became the hut that moved between worlds. And the goddess who had been driven from the villages, who had once received the souls of the dead at the winter's end, found her way into that abandoned structure and settled there. She was no longer worshipped. She was no longer named in prayers. But she was never truly gone. The forest had simply given her a new address, and the stories had given her a new face. That face carried a mark no one could explain, but everyone understood. The bony leg, kostyanaya noga, bare yellow bone from hip to foot. It was not a wound. It was a statement, written in the language of the body. one leg in the grave, one leg in the living world. She was not dead, and she was not alive. She was the threshold between, and the threshold must be marked so that no one crosses it by mistake. Every culture in the ancient world had its liminal guardians, and the Slavs, in their dark forests, had her. When Christianity arrived with its bright icons and its single god, the old idols were toppled into the rivers. The sacred groves were felled. The rituals that had marked the turning of the year were forbidden or absorbed into the church calendar, their old meanings bleached out like bones in the sun. But the crone would not be bleached. She retreated into the oral tradition, into the tales told by grandmothers, in the long winter dark, where no priest could hear and no bishop could censor. The forest was her sanctuary, and the story was her scripture. The three riders who attended her, white, red, black, were fragments of an older solar mythology, a trinity of dawn, noon, and night that had once been worshipped in its own right. Their names were lost. Their temples, if they ever had any, were gone. But they survived as her silent companions, riding their eternal circuit around the hut. Because stories are conservative creatures. They keep what the world forgets, tucked into the margins where no one thinks to look for theology. The mortar and pestle, the broom that swept the sky, the red kerchief, the iron teeth in the door, each detail, when held up to the light of scholarship, revealed itself as a layer of sediment deposited by centuries of belief. The mortar was a tool of transformation, crushing grain and bone alike. The broom was a boundary marker, sweeping away the traces between worlds. She was not a single invention. She was a palimpsest, a manuscript written and overwritten by generations who had never met each other, but who all, somehow, knew her name. And yet, for all the scholarship, for all the careful archaeology and comparative mythology, something refused to be explained. The terror of her. The strange, unshakable sense that she was not merely a symbol or a survival from a pre-Christian past, but something real. A law of the wild that wore a grandmother's face. The scholars could trace her lineage to Morena in the funerary huts, but they could not explain why the story still made the skin prickle on the back of the neck. Some things are older than explanation. Some things are simply true, and they wait in the dark for someone to find them. In the 20th century, when scholars began to study folktales not as entertainment, but as the fossilized remains of ancient belief, Baba Yaga became a different kind of subject. Vladimir Propp, in his Morphology of the Folktale, mapped her role with surgical precision. She was the donor, the tester, the guardian of the threshold between the ordinary world and the magical one. She was not a character so much as a function, a gear in the machinery of transformation. But even Propp, who was not given to poetry, could not make her feel mechanical. The stories resisted. The crone refused to be a gear. The feminists came to her next, and they saw something the scholars had missed. Here was a woman who was never wife, never mother in the soft sense, never subject to any man's authority. She lived alone in the deep woods. She answered to no one. She was terrifying and powerful, and completely, unapologetically herself. In an age that was beginning to question the old stories about what women could be, Baba Yaga became not a monster to be feared, but a patron saint of female autonomy, difficult, demanding, and utterly free. The crone, it turned out, had always been waiting for women brave enough to claim her. She found her way into art, into literature, into film. She appeared in the margins of novels and the backgrounds of animated features. A Russian composer named Mussorgsky placed her in the center of his most famous work, the pounding rhythms of her mortal flight, rendered in brass and timpani. Illustrators painted her hut on chicken legs in 1,000 different styles, each one trying to capture what the old storytellers had known that she was, somehow more than the sum of her parts. A bone leg, a red kerchief, a grinding bowl. And yet, assembled, she became something the imagination could not release. Her most famous cinematic incarnation came from a Japanese animator who had grown up on Russian folktales. Hayao Miyazaki's Yubaba in Spirited Away is Baba Yaga through a different cultural lens. The massive head, the commanding presence, the bathhouse that serves the spirits. The girl who must work to earn her freedom. Miyazaki understood something essential about the crone, that she was not a villain to be defeated, but a force to be navigated. A challenge that existed not to destroy the hero, but to reveal who the hero really was. The boundary had crossed an ocean and still held its shape. Neil Gaiman, too, found his way to her, and in his Sandman comics, and later his novel The Graveyard Book, her silhouette is unmistakable. The kind but terrifying supernatural woman who lives at the edge of things, who offers the protagonist what they need, but demands something in return, who cannot be lied to or charmed or defeated by strength alone. The Anglo-American imagination, so used to witches who were simply evil, struggled to categorize her. That was the point. She resisted categorization. She always had. There is no need to list every appearance. It is enough to know that the crone who first coalesced in the dark forests of Eastern Europe, who was once a goddess, then a demon, then a folktale, then a scholarly footnote, had become something far stranger. She had become immortal in the way that only stories can be immortal, not by being frozen in amber, but by being retold, reshaped, and rediscovered by every generation that needed her. And every generation, in its own way, did need her. The world kept producing girls sent into the dark by cruel stepmothers. The world kept producing thresholds that could not be crossed without a test. The archaeological record cannot confirm her existence, but it can confirm the existence of the world that dreamed her. The dark forests that once covered all of Europe, where wolves howled and travelers vanished. The funerary huts on stilts, excavated from ancient Finno Ugric sites. The straw effigies of winter crones, burned in ritual fires whose ashes are still being unearthed. The old women who lived alone at the edge of villages, who knew which herbs cured and which herbs killed, who were called to attend births and deaths, who were feared and respected, and sometimes, when the crops failed, burned. Baba Yaga is not a memory of one such woman. She is a memory of all of them. The doll, too, has its own archaeology. The protective figurine passed from mother to daughter, the small guardian made of scraps and blessed with a dying wish, is found in cultures across the world. In the Slavic tradition, it survived in the stories of Vasilisa, but its roots go deeper, into the pre-Christian practice of keeping household spirits, small representations of ancestors who guarded the hearth and advised the living. The doll was not magic in the way the church feared. It was older than magic. It was love, stitched into linen. And love, unlike magic, does not require belief to work. And so we return, as all stories about Baba Yaga must eventually return, to the clearing, to the hut that turns on its chicken legs, its tooth-latched door waiting, to the fence of bones and the skulls that burn with a fire that never needed fuel. To the old woman in the red kerchief, grinding roots and bones in her iron mortar, her amber eyes catching the firelight. She is still there. She has always been there. She will be there when the last village is dust and the last story is told, because she is not something that can be outlived. She is the dark forest itself, and the dark forest has never been smaller than it is today. It has only been waiting for us to remember that we need it. And if you find yourself one day at the edge of your own dark forest, if your stepmother's voice is still ringing in your ears, if the path behind you has disappeared and the path ahead is no path at all, remember the doll. Remember the girl who stood before the tooth-latched door with nothing but a blessing and a willingness to work. Remember that the crone does not devour the humble. She arms them. And then, when you are ready, whisper the words that have been whispered for 1,000 years. Little hut, turn your back to the forest and your front to me. The hut will turn. It is always turned. And whatever waits inside, you will face it with the fire of every girl who ever walked into the dark and came back carrying light.